graduated in 2004, so that's been a while back.
2010 is when I started, and we still do those leadership institutes, and we're bringing them back. We're doing them more with English learning immigrant families and things like that now, so that's been kind of exciting. So yeah, the Justice Center, we are an organization that represents low-income North Carolinians. It started as part of Legal Aid originally. So Legal Aid is an organization that provides legal representation for low-income folks. But we started doing a lot of kind of lobbying work at the legislature because we were seeing it wasn't just the lack of legal representation that was harming people who are living in poverty, but also the actual laws of the state. So we started, naturally in our advocacy for our clients, going down to the legislature and advocating there. And then they said they'd made some changes to the law at the federal level that said you couldn't use the money that was given. Legal aid has a lot of federal money, a lot of state money. And they said that you couldn't use that money for lobbying work. So then we broke off from legal aid and got funding from private foundations and things like that, and individual donors, so that way we'd be able to still do that type of work. So we're still in the same building as legal aid. We still share, we try to refer clients to one another and things like that. So the Justice Center does that kind of, we're probably more known for that government relations work that we do. But we also have attorneys who provide legal representation. It's usually on what we would call impact litigation. So something like an IEP hearing is something that legal aid would do, where they would take on an individual client and they would go help them navigate the IEP process. Whereas what we would want to do is more, a bigger case involving state or federal law that would impact a large class of people around special education law or something else like that. So probably a good example would be the Leandro case, which is North Carolina's version of a school funding lawsuit. That's the case that's established that everybody has the right to get a sound basic education, and there's certain things that are laid out that you have to have access to a high quality teacher, and you have to have adequate resources to give you the opportunity to get a sound basic education. That case is over 20 years old. We've been working on it that whole time. It's sort of entering a really cool new phase where they had the judge who had always overseen that case for many years, named Judge Manning. He retired, and so now there's a new judge in the case who then both parties moved to have an independent consultant do a review of our school funding system, which in our opinion is really inadequate. And it looks like that study will show that. No one's really sure kind of what comes next, but to me it's kind of exciting that no one in the state has ever done this before. Republicans, Democrats, whoever runs it, nobody wants to look at our school funding system to determine if it's adequate. They'll look at it and say, is it equitable? Are we dividing up the pie the right way? But no one wants to look and see, are we providing enough funding to actually help students reach all of the proficiency goals and things that we've set, because they know what it'll show, which will show that it's not enough.
We learned from having our superintendent here that Cumberland County is considered one of the 10 poorest counties in North Carolina.
So they're super impacted by the Leandro case, because it really is, those are the districts that started it. It was brought by the lowest income districts in the state, because those were the children who were getting the least resources and having the biggest achievement gaps and the worst outcomes. So I'm excited for that new phase that it's moving into. I mean, at some point you need the legislature to appropriate the money though, which means, determining, are they going to change their tax policy so we can have more money for education? Are they going to divert money from other things towards education? So regardless of the court case, you have to have people advocating in large numbers at the legislature to actually fulfill whatever the court comes up with. So we do that type of litigation. We also have people who represent, a lot of organizations can't represent people who are undocumented or immigrant families, again, because of those same laws about using federal money, but we're able to do that. So that's one of the main things we do is provide those types of legal services. We have all kinds of, I'm from the education project, we have a health project, consumer rights, workers' rights. We have people working on environmental issues, housing. These are all things that we think impact folks who are living in poverty. It's usually, when they come to us, there's not just one issue. They might have an issue with housing, but then we'll also find out that they might be having trouble enrolling their child in school or getting the services they need, IEPs and things like that, or that they may have a problem with access to unemployment benefits, or it could be anything. Usually there's lots of things happening in your life when you're having those types of issues when you're living in poverty. So we cover all of those different issues. But within our project, I do the lobbying work, and I'm an attorney, and then we have somebody who does outreach, Sarah Montgomery. So the idea there is that there's lots of people across the state who are advocating for education in their local communities. I think most people think when there's a problem in your school, you go to the school. It's probably the principal's fault or the school district's fault, or but a lot of things are actually coming from the state level, where 60% of the funding for education comes from the state in North Carolina. A lot of states, more of the money will come locally. So we're kind of unique that way, that most of it's coming from the state, and a lot of policies have come from the state. And certainly that's been the case over the last decade, that there's been massive amounts of policy changes that have had a huge impact on schools locally. So we're trying to get those groups that have formed in different counties to work together as part of a network that advocates at the legislatures. I think a lot of people are saying that that's where a lot of the concerns that folks have, or the problems are emanating from there. Like, just an example would be, did anyone ever hear about the class size chaos that happened over the last few years? So this was I think a well-meaning piece of legislation where the legislature mandated smaller class sizes in grades K through 3, but they didn't appropriate enough money to pay for the teachers that would take to make those classes smaller. So then districts started having to do things like make other classes besides K through 3 larger, much larger. They looked to lay off gym, PE, the music, art, the specialist teachers. And so parents got extremely upset when they found out that they were about to lose these teachers who were teaching subjects that were really important to them. There was all kinds of massive amounts of rallies happening at the legislature. They eventually had to appropriate over $200 million more to help pay for those, but they weren't going to do it without that level of advocacy that occurred from just hearing from everyone from back in their home districts. So that's kind of the theory behind doing that organizing work, is that I'm definitely a big people power person at this point. When I came into this work, I thought it would just be me go to the legislature with a bunch of facts, and they would think these facts were amazing and do what I wanted them to do. And then it turned out that's not the case, that they need to be hearing from people. And people can have, I think, a much bigger impact than they realize. It's a very sort of open environment. When you go down there, it's very easy to meet with people. There's a lot of people who feel like they can't have an impact at the state level because it feels so far removed, and so the result of that is a lot of people aren't doing anything there. That's changed a lot over the last decade, I think, as people have gotten more politically active. But that's the only time where I get wins over there, is when large numbers of people are weighing in on these issues. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else that just centers. And we also we have researchers. There's a guy in my project named Chris Nordstrom who worked at the legislature's fiscal research division, so he's really good at figuring out, he knows a lot about teacher pay and how to analyze that. He knows a lot about how all of our schedules work for those types of things. When individual bills are proposed, he will sit down and say, what's their impact going to be on children, particularly low-income children in communities of color. So we do still go down there with the research. It's just, it needs to have people behind it too. So I was asked to talk some about and please just interrupt if there's questions or anything. I don't have anything super specific I wanted to hit on, but we were talking about the standard. Is it? Which is it's one of the standards that's that teachers should be advocates for students, and there's real challenges to that, I think, at the legislature. But we do see these sort of big high-profile events like last year on May 17th. There was
Red for Ed.
That's right.
They're going to march again too, I think.
This is,
Yes.
I think, a timely, yep. And so last year there were about, they say 20,000. I think it was more. You just.
Did y'all see that on the news, Red for Ed?
The
So
big
there were-
march.
Yeah.
There were teacher strikes across the country in places that have particularly poor pay for teachers and working conditions, like Oklahoma, West Virginia, Arizona. Those are always places that are ranked really low on per pupil expenditure, average teacher pay. And there were a lot of interesting things that kind of happened on social media where, the one that I remember was this little girl who lived in Oklahoma. She had Blake Shelton's textbook. And so she was all excited, and her mom was like, what the heck, that textbook's 35 years old, you know, and you're and so there were these strikes that happened across the country, and they actually led to, you know, major changes where people said they were willing to pay more in taxes, essentially, in order to pay their teachers more and to up the pupil expenditure and have children have more resources. And
I have mixed feelings about that because, let's see, St. Louis, I was in St. Louis, no, I wasn't teaching there, but we were in St. Louis in the 60s, and you won't remember this, but the St. Louis school teachers walked out at the beginning of the second semester, and they would not come back, and they did not come back. And what bothered me and what made me, as a teacher, say no unions and no walkouts, was that they impacted kids for one whole year that had to go back to school to finish, you know, so I have mixed feelings about
that.
I mean, one day is okay, but these folks walked out for a whole year.
Yeah,
I mean, for a whole semester.
Wow.
And did not come back.
Yeah, they don't usually last that long.
Yeah, I was just really, and so that really kind of, it was a union strike, and that really kind of, I thought, I understand why you're striking, but, you know, that's a little to the extreme, because there was a whole class of graduating seniors that had to go back to school another year to finish because of their actions.
Yeah,
It's
so
horrible.
I feel like you shouldn't. I feel like you should do things to, you know, benefit yourself, but like, don't let it impact
Right.
the
It
students.
When it has such a negative impact on your children and the, you know, people that you're supposed to be helping in the first place, I mean, you're kind of defeating the purpose. I
Yeah.
think they should have been punished for that.
Well, I don't know whatever happened, but no, they're walking out on Monday, right? The May the 1st is when they're,
Yeah, and so ours, like you said, is a little different.
It's
we
one
don't,
day,
we
yeah.
don't have, you're not allowed to have a teachers union in North Carolina. So there's still an association, the North Carolina Association of Educators, and so they don't have the power to strike like that, and they also don't have the ability to collectively bargain. So what that means in other states is that teachers will form a union, and then they have representatives who will go and they actually work as a unit, will figure out all the things around compensation for teachers and things like that. So they have a lot more sort of bargaining power when they're doing it collectively. Right now, what they have to do in North Carolina is just advocate at the legislature to try to get teacher pay improved. So they don't have that ability to strike. So last year, what they did was they had a teacher walkout day where teachers took a day off on May 17th and came to the legislature, and there were about 30,000 people there. I think they say 20,000, but I really think it was more because there were people coming in and out all day. I've never seen anything like this before. It was just everybody wearing red shirts, a complete sea of red all the way up and down Fayetteville Street, which is the main street and leading outside the Capitol building. Wireless network didn't work, cell phones didn't work. It was, there were so many people there. It was also the first day that they had security at the legislature, so there was like these crazy lines of. I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, but. And to your point, I think what they did there that was really responsible was because, as you said, you're advocating for yourself and you're advocating for your children. I think teachers end up being the best advocates for children for a lot of reasons. I think one is that obviously these are the people who have chosen to spend their lives working with children. They sort of know them best. They're in the best place to advocate for them and see what their needs are. The other is that teachers are just such an important component of the child's education, the most important part. So in advocating for better teacher conditions, teacher pay, I think in a way you really are advocating for your child, because the best people that we can have in teaching, the more good people we can have in teaching, then the better off our children are going to be. And there have been things that have happened in some of these states that had these strikes where the conditions have gotten poor enough that maybe this was justified. But here I think it was just a one-day thing. What they did that I thought was great was they were really careful at making sure that children had somewhere to go that day, that there was food provided, because these are the issues with the longer-term strike too, is that it's not just that people don't get to go to school or get their education. There are people who rely on schools to get their breakfast, to get their lunch. There are working families who aren't able to plan for what happens when you take a day off. So I do hope for this year's rally, that they'll be able to pull that together, because the only thing that makes me nervous is that they just announced it a week or so ago. So that's not a lot of time to work all those things out, but I'm hopeful that because they did it last time so well, they'll do it this time as well too. It's going to be a challenge. The other thing they did really well was that how they behaved at the legislature. So I think there's a lot of sort of anger about what this legislature has done on education issues. They've made a lot of sort of massive changes. Teacher pay dropped off a cliff in North Carolina during the recession in 2008 and 9. And so this is sort of a bipartisan thing. We had Democrats in control and teacher pay plummeted during the recession because when there's a recession, people make less money, the state takes less money in, and so we have less money available to pay out for things like teacher salaries. And then in 2010, the Republicans took over for the first time in over 100 years, where they controlled the entire legislature. It made a lot, and they had to make some tough choices. And rather than raising revenue, they chose to cut a lot of things, and a lot of those were in education. They cut huge amounts out of the education budget, so the teacher pay continued to fall. I think they got a tremendous amount of blowback from that. And they had a very sort of anti-public school agenda, or at least that was the way it was perceived by many, and me included, to be honest, at that time. And I think that's changed a lot, where I think they've gotten that North Carolina is a state that values its public schools, that it's really shouldn't be a partisan issue whether you believe in public education. I think where they differ is probably in the reliance on school choice. They did a lot of, that same time, a lot of really aggressive things in the school choice front of creating a really large voucher program that grows every year till 2024 to the point where we'll be spending $140-something million on that. There was a charter school cap that you could only have 100 charter schools that they lifted. Now we have about 170 charter schools. So kind of as the funding went down, we created these other school choice programs at the same time that had the effect of diverting more money from the public school system. So it was bad timing to do those, in my opinion, that while you're losing money, you don't want to create a whole new parallel school system that costs a lot of money. But that's what they did. They made some changes that were really unpopular amongst teachers about, they got rid of supplemental pay for teachers who had master's degrees, which was kind of a strange one. They tried to get rid of career status. People think of it as tenure, which is it's due process rights that you have if someone tries to fire you. Basically, it doesn't say you can't be fired, but that there has to be a process that you have the opportunity to challenge that decision or sue what grounds it was made on. And there's only certain specific reasons why they can do it. So they got rid of that, and then one that hasn't been talked about as much is that teachers' ability to participate in the retirement system will end in 2021. So that's one of the big things on the list of.
I know about that one.
So for NCAA's list for this year's rally on May 1st, that's one of their main items to try to restore that before it goes away, to bring back master's degree pay. But kind of to the point of advocating for your students, they have things that don't so directly impact teachers in there too, like Medicaid expansion. They have there's also, they want to have a living wage for all school employees, not just teachers. So right now, there's classes of people who work in the schools that do get paid $15 an hour or so, but there are people who get paid less than that. So they're trying to bring them up to a living wage standard. So they are sort of, I've always been impressed that NCAE has tried to do things that don't just immediately impact teachers and salaries and benefits and things like that. They do a lot of things that impact kids around like pre-K or things that just aren't directly impacting them. So I think they've been effective that way. The other thing they do is provide legal representation. If you have an issue at your school and it could be around a hiring and firing decision or something else that's happened in your school, that by paying those dues you will get legal representation. So that's one of the benefits. But the other, I think, is that there's an association that has tens of thousands of people that can sort of speak in one voice at the legislature when they're asking for these various changes. There are other teacher groups. There's PENC, which is Professional Educators of North Carolina. I think that's seen as it's a smaller group that's seen as being maybe a little more on the conservative side and probably has some better relationships with the Republican members. I think NCAE is perceived as being aligned a lot of times with the Democratic Party. They're not always, so they sort of have two wings in the government relations field. It's kind of interesting. They can work on actual. I'm not allowed, since I'm at a 501c3 nonprofit, I'm not allowed to lobby. I'm allowed to lobby, but I'm not allowed to advocate, say, vote for so-and-so. But NCAA can do that. They can get involved in local elections. So they have that kind of power to endorse candidates. And then they also have the, the power to advocate at the legislature. But that's been, I think, a challenge for them because of that perception that they're so aligned with the Democratic Party and the legislature being controlled by Republicans.
I have another question. What effect, I don't know how to say this, does the pay scale from the Dodea schools have on the North Carolina? Because we got paid an awful lot more than what these guys here. I mean, I retired at $75,000 and I get, and my retirement pay is almost as much as what I was getting when I was teaching. So how does that figure into their?
That's a good idea. I should think about that more.
I mean, seriously, because, well, there's just two school systems, though, actually, Dodea here,
Yeah.
Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune.
Yeah.
And I mean, their teachers' starting salary is extraordinarily more than what, and we did participate in the program you were talking about, career status. It was part of Fort Bragg's system. You had career status 1, 2, and 3, and I know it was a pilot program across the state, but I never heard what happened to it. Fort Bragg let it go, it got too expensive
Right.
for them. They couldn't afford us after a while.
I think that's a really good. Well, now you're giving me a good idea because I mean, anytime you can bring military angle to anything over there, it's going to go better. You see it a lot with like payday lending, where there'll be some law that kind of makes it so the fees and things are worse on people who take payday loans or other kind of aggressive, things that there are these programs that tend to prey on veterans or people in the military that if you can show that, then you can sort of stop those things from being created. And I think the same would be true in education. But some of it we have used where there have been the BRAC realignments sometimes. So when they're talking about which military bases are we going to close and where are we going to put more people, where are we going to invest more, one of the factors that we'll look at is the quality of the local education system. So it can help us to say we need to invest in our education system, or else when these decisions are made by groups like the Army or in the military groups of where to put their bases, they're going to look at our system and say we're going to go elsewhere. And that's, I think, true of businesses too. I think that there's that argument there too, like that if we don't invest more in our education system, we're going to have trouble attracting businesses in the way that we have in the past, which I think is true.
Well, they're not going to close Fort Bragg. I can tell you.
No, that's true. Yeah, so I think maybe there's not too much fear there, but I guess they could choose to not make it as big. I'm from Norfolk area, so I'm kind of in that same boat. Like they're not closing Norfolk. That's too big of a naval base.
But I mean, that might make a good comparison to compare the
Yeah.
salaries that the Dodea people get as compared to
That's a great idea.
the state.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure I know there's a big difference.
Right.
I know there's a tremendous difference.
Right. And I think part of it is because we're just so far below the national average, where I think it was around 10,000. I think it's maybe between $6,000 and $8,000 to get to the national average from where we are now, which if you think about it is incredibly expensive at the state level, because you take that $6,000 and multiply it by over 100,000 teachers, that's a big number. So it takes a huge investment. I think that's really the problem we're having, is the money has to come from somewhere, and people don't. The legislature is pretty averse to doing anything on taxes. I think that's changed amongst people. I think people don't want to pay taxes obviously either, but when you say it's to improve education or teacher pay or for the materials that'll be in schools, and people are feeling like their schools are under-resourced, that people will pay that. But it's a conversation that's not really happening right now at the legislature about, are we going to raise taxes or things like that. That's not what they're about. So I think that we're kind of, what concerns me would be the next recession actually. I think we've put more money back in the system since it went off the cliff in that period I was describing back in 2010, but not much considering how much the state has grown, how much the economy has grown. Our effort level's really low. The effort means how much of the state's gross domestic product, how much of the money we make as a state is going into education, and that has really fallen off over the last decade. So if we have another recession, because we've got all of our tax rates so low and such low levels of investment in education in comparison to how much money we have, if we have less money, we're really going to fall down to a really low level. So that's definitely a concern. But I'm trying to think of, I feel like I should open up for more questions too. And there's a lot of stuff that has been happening over there.
I can remember this is obviously 2009 and 10, I was trying to that time, what was really a big issue was the suspension of students with special needs and the big suspension of African American males. And I think that we've had some changes in how these things are handled
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Um,
And yeah, there was a good law passed at the state level that dealt with that. I think that one I think varies a lot from district to district, because each district has its own sort of student teacher handbook and or parent student handbook, and they, have a lot of different, there's a lot of local control over what your discipline policies are. So you'll see huge disparities some places, huge progress other places. Just an example of that is we worked in Wake County where they had really amazingly high levels of expulsions and suspensions because they had a lot of zero tolerance policies. So they just had these policies, and those are that's what
That's
really
right,
has
the
changed.
zero
And so,
tolerance
yeah,
policies, yeah.
that's what's changed a lot. So those are just things written in where the principal and the teacher has no discretion to say how long a kid ought to be, how the kid ought to be disciplined. That it's just in the handbook. This is if you do X, you're out for 10 days. And so sometimes what we found was that people were getting suspended where no one who was involved in the incident really thought they ought to be. But because it said that in the handbook, it was happening. I mean, it's hard to find the balance between zero tolerance and lots of discretion, because sometimes lots of discretion will also lead to these sort of racially disparate income disparities. So you have to find a bit of a balance there. But so in Wake County, we did a Title VI complaint, which is a complaint you file with the federal government based on discrimination. Just because you could see children of color were being suspended at higher rates, but also for the exact same activity. So like if you brought a cell phone to school, white students were 50% less likely to be suspended for that than black students, even though it's the exact same offense. So we brought those numbers and filed them with the Office of Civil Rights, which is a part of the Department of Education, and used that as a way to negotiate with the school district about how do we change these policies. So it was really neat. We had groups of community members, teachers, and principals all working with the school district and the board. We had our own subcommittee, and our job was to revise that policy manual. And so we flagged all the things that we thought were leading to the biggest disparities. And they're still there, but the expulsion rate was cut by, way more than half. And the disparities have come down. They're still there, but it was, pretty dramatic change over like a 1 or 2 year period, which is hard to do in education generally, just from changing those policies. So that's still a huge issue when we go to talk about, when we go to do an education presentation somewhere amongst parents. Usually school discipline, school assignment, IEP, those are the issues that are at the forefront of people's minds, at least in the communities that we work in, where there's real issues with how discipline's being handed out. And same thing with the crossover of special education and discipline, where kids are getting sometimes suspended and expelled for just that. You're not supposed to be suspended or expelled if the bad thing you're doing, if the misbehavior is a manifestation of your disability. But I think a lot of people struggle with that, where it's like, the kid just does something that we know is wrong, and so we suspend or expel them. But you have rights under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that say you're not supposed to get suspended if the reason you're doing that action is because it's caused by your disability. So that's one we see really constantly in our sort of meetings around the state. The other one that I've seen a lot recently is the facilities. That there are really bad facility problems in this state. And I sort of knew that in the data sense before this, that we have an $8 billion, as of 2016, we had an $8 billion backlog in facility costs. So that means building new schools and renovations to old schools. So that was $8 billion in 2016. Since then, we've had 2 hurricanes. And those always cause a ton of damage. Tons of mold remediation is really common in schools after that. And that was still something that's going on. I did a tour of the eastern counties in the aftermath of the hurricanes. And there were places that were obviously underwater. Even as far away as like Pitt County, there were weird things. Frogs. I saw a lot of frogs. One had snakes falling from the ceiling, which was really amazing, and that was in Pitt County. Yeah, no, that was not like a Samuel L. Jackson movie or anything. Yeah, no, there was So I think, and it affects everywhere. I mean, if you go to what you might think is a more affluent county, you'll see a lot of the schools that are there are from the 1970s or earlier. It's just not very common to build new buildings right now. So we have this huge backlog. To me, it's probably way more than $8 billion because of those hurricanes, and just because every year you defer maintenance and don't do it, it becomes a lot more expensive. Yeah, that's true of everything, I think. So we have one thing that's up now that's sort of getting fixed is we have a bond, a school bond that's been proposed. So the governor proposed a $3.9 billion bond. Traditionally, building the school buildings is the responsibility of the local school district. But there's some places that just lack the tax base to do that. So no matter how much they increase their tax rates, the people's income is so low in some of these areas that it wouldn't be enough, generate enough money to build new schools. 'Cause it's pretty expensive. It's about $22 million to build one elementary school.
That's to furnish it and everything, or
Just to build it, yeah. That backlog represents a lot of that, but I think also a lot of renovations. But so the governor's $4 billion bond still wouldn't have covered that whole need that I described, but there's a lot of districts that can raise pretty significant amounts of money, like Wake and Charlotte will do, really large bonds in the hundreds of millions. So sort of through a combination of local bonds to raise money for buildings and this statewide bond, it would start to, I think, help fix it. The legislature has two proposals. One in the House side, which is another bond, but it's only $1.9 billion. But that's probably the one that the governor will end up going behind, just because he doesn't have the power to put in his own legislation or move it. He just puts out proposals. So I think he's supportive of that bond. And then on the other side, the Senate has this pay-as-you-go plan, which we collect all the money from the state, they take off 4% of it, and then they use 4% of it, that 4% to pay for new school buildings. So the difference there is that if you do a bond, it's confusing how they work, but it's essentially new money. Well, you're going to have to pay it in the future, and there's an interest rate, which is really low right now, but it's a way to sort of pay using debt now to help pay for things in the future. So you don't want to have a ton of debt, but there's a reasonable amount of debt you could have. So the good thing about the bond, I think, is that it doesn't do that and take money out of the education budget in the front end. It just adds it on. So the pay-as-you-go one the Senate does, it's great that they're going to spend that money on buildings, but all that money that they're going to spend is coming out of our ability to pay for teacher pay, textbooks, all the nurses, counselors, and those sorts of things. So in our mind, the House plan is better, but I think we'll probably end up with some compromise version that takes elements of both. But we'll still only have addressed $2 billion out of the maybe $10 billion of need. So that's something the teacher groups have been really awesome at advocating for, because I think they see it most clearly.
Folks realize that charter schools are considered public schools. What are charter schools?
No, yeah. So charter schools are public schools. They are not subject to the same regulations. I think they're exempted from a whole lot of them. I mean, the ones that seem to be most commonly talked about are usually around, one, they don't have to pay teachers on the pay scale, so I think sometimes they get more creative with the way that they pay folks. The pay is usually on average a little lower for teachers in charter schools. The big difference to me is also just sort of how they're governed. So, normally you elect your local school board and your local county commissioners, and at least in North Carolina we have county commissioners, and those are the people who will oversee your local schools. But the charter schools are created at the state level. So a group, it has to be a nonprofit, but they can partner with a for-profit organization. They're called charter management organizations or education management organizations. And these are groups that sort of specialize in running charter schools. They're often national. Then they've gotten, I think at first charter schools were very organic. There would be sort of like a community group that decided they just want to start a school. We see this problem in our community, we want to start it. But over time, people have figured out, there's kind of money in this thing. And so there's groups that have formed and said, and they will help you do your application to start your school. And they will help you set up your school and develop your education plan. And they will provide a lot of the services that schools normally have. They'll do the kind of contracting with people who provide food and books and testing and all those types of materials that you need. So they still do have to take the same tests as traditional public school students, but so that's a big difference. You know, normally it's like an elected board that you've elected locally that's deciding where we're going to build a new school or how are we going to manage our schools. Here it's coming from the state. They apply to the State Board of Education, and there's a charter advisory council that reviews all the applications and decides which ones they're going to approve. So they're just managed at this kind of state level, and they have a board that they answer to, but it's not, you know, an elected board or anything like that.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I never understood, what exactly is a charter school anyway?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, that's the big, the charter is like, so normally, the charter is the thing you kind of do in your application. So they'll apply to the state and say, I want to open a school. So here's our charter. We're going to do this. So usually it's some sort of specialized thing, like they might serve, you know, I've seen ones that serve all kids with disabilities. So in their charter, they will say, our mission is to serve children who have severe autism. And they'll have
We have one
School
here
of Hope.
in downtown Fayetteville, the Capital Encore Academy,
Mhm.
and then its chief thing is the School of the Arts.
Right. So there's usually some kind of theme around it. So, and it could go in either direction. Some of them are designed to serve lots of kids who have discipline problems or kids from low-income families. Other schools are designed to serve kids almost more like we think of a private school being. Like they're serving kids who are, you know, on a college prep track and have really high, some of them have, you're not supposed to have admission standards, but some of them sort of did in the past where they would only let kids in who for like a high school, they would only let people in if they had already finished 9th grade math and 8th grade. Well, so then that's not really a normal public school at that point. You've just created a school that's for higher achieving kids.
There was just an article in the paper, and I can't remember if it just dealt with North Carolina or if it was, I think it was just North Carolina, about the number of charter schools that they invested a lot of money in and they have closed and they have failed because of mismanagement of money or,
Yeah.
you know, just,
That's a big problem. So because just the disruption that causes too when they close, it's really difficult. So that's one thing that is different about charter schools that I think their supporters would point to, is that if the school's not doing well, it'll close. Usually it closes for the reason you said, though, that there's under enrollment and then they have financial problems and have to close. And then there's this sort of mad scramble of we have to reassign all the kids who are in that school back into the public school system, sometimes in the middle of the school year. That's definitely one serious problem. So that's why we are for really sort of stricter accountability on the schools, that if you're going to open one of these things, you better be darn sure it's going to go well, that you're not going to have to close it. So we think there should be pretty high standards on the front end to make sure that we don't have that, because that's a pretty traumatic event. You can see when they do vote to close it, people show up from the school and talk about how great the school was, and will, you know, often sue to try to keep the school open.
Well, that's what was going to be my question. I didn't know what involvement, or if there was any involvement of the North Carolina Justice Center with charter schools.
So yes, we'll do things like, I'll read the applications each year, and then I'll submit our kind of concerns about the batch of applicants. So sometimes there was one time where we sent some concerns about these 3 schools had contracted with these education management organizations that were from Florida that had serious problems with fraud and embezzlement there. And so we were kind of saying, well, we probably don't need to open a school that's run by a place that's already gotten in trouble for fraud. And they did eventually, partially because of us, we weren't the only ones, they did eventually reject those applications once they sort of figured it out. That's why that process is important. You can't just be approving
Right.
anyone. You know, you have to make sure, it's not that easy to start a school and run a school, and so you have to make sure whoever's doing that is really prepared. So North Carolina's got sort of what I would call like a free market approach to it, though. Some places have my idea that we're only going to approve the very highest quality applicants and people who are really clearly can do this, and then other places like North Carolina say, let's just approve lots of them. Parents will gravitate towards the schools that are doing really well, and sort of the weaker schools won't get people to enroll them and they'll just fall off. But that to me creates that sort of crazy churn we have where you're only in 3rd grade once. Like you're not a guinea pig. Like if you're in 3rd grade and the school doesn't work and we close it, then to me that's an unacceptable outcome. But to other people it's kind of like, well, that is the market figuring it out though. So you know, I'm not really a big fan of that. The other problem we have is charter schools don't have to provide transportation or free and reduced price lunch, and so that is a huge barrier for lots of kids to attend. People from working families who aren't able to, provide their own transportation, students with disabilities. A lot of the schools will have their transportation plan will be, we're going to have carpooling. Well, if you're a child in a wheelchair, the carpooling is probably not going to work unless everybody in the carpool has a wheelchair accessible van. So that is a huge barrier. And like I said, same with free and reduced price lunch, where sort of a shocking percentage of kids rely on schools to get their meals, and so if they're not going to be provided at a school, then that school's not really an option. I've seen some sort of strange things happen too, where there'll be like a private school that closes, decides to reopen as a charter school, only sends the notice of that you should apply to attend the school to the people who were in the private school before. And so then essentially we just converted a private school just into a charter. You're not supposed to do that, but that has happened. You're supposed to have an open lottery for everybody. You're supposed to advertise it. But a lot of places, and I hate to bash them because some places do this some of them do provide transportation and free and reduced price lunch and do the lottery right and focus on having services for low-income kids, for students with disabilities. But they're doing it of their own good heart. They're not required to do it the same way public schools are. And so because of that transportation and free and reduced lunch issue, you'll see the kids who are in charter schools are a little bit less likely to be from low-income families. They're less likely to be disabled. The disabilities they have are less severe. They're just often not set up to deal with kids in the same way. Public schools are really good at sort of taking all comers. For a small school that's just starting it, and then you have 5 kids who are really on the high needs end of the autism spectrum. A lot of times they have never taught a kid like that and have no idea how to do it. And so then parents naturally choose not to go to that school, and you end up with a population that has a different level of need. And so we've also seen really high levels of segregation in charter schools in North Carolina. So we have a lot of schools that have lots of white kids. We have a lot of kids that have lots of children of color, and they're more segregated than public schools, and they're also they cause some level of segregation in the districts they're located too. So I think, to me, it's not about whether we have charter schools or not, but you have to have policies that govern them that stop some of these things from happening. So it's that free market thing. Like public schools have all kinds of rules they have to follow, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
because our department here has all kinds of rules we have to follow.
So yeah, yeah. I mean, there's just, you name it, with all the testing and the sort of, obviously all the federal laws around students with disabilities and all the requirements the state makes around how they report things out and things. So it's a lot that's being put on public schools that's not being put on charter schools. They're trying to use that model of just parents will choose the best ones, and it's kind of the theory behind them, at least here. Other places, they were seen as laboratories of innovation. Like, let's just start up a few of these charter schools that are doing things very differently from our public schools and see if we learn anything in these places that we can replicate and use in other public schools.
It's actually very easy in the state of North Carolina to open up a school. I could go tomorrow and open up my own school. How easy it is. No, it really is.
Yeah, it's not that
easy.
bad. Yeah,
Yeah. Are you involved in the homeschool?
not as much on that. Sometimes it does end up crossing over. Like, we have virtual charter schools in North Carolina.
Oh, that's right, about 3 of them, I think.
Yeah, and so we have the North Carolina Virtual Public School, but that is more of what's called a blended model, where you're doing some of your learning using online and then some of it in the brick and mortar school. And most of the you can even do the North Carolina Virtual Public School work in the school and in the media center, but you can also do it at home, and it's for students who might be homebound. But there's always that kind of blended approach, whereas the virtual charter school, in addition to not being a public school, it's all done at home. You don't go to a school, you attend school online. It's pretty amazing. It's been tried in other states and done very, very poorly. Just objectively, the performance is sort of out of this world. Like, Stanford did a study about them, where they found that students lost the equivalent of 180 days of math instruction over the course of a year in the virtual charter schools across the country, and there's only 180 days in the year. So it was as if the children didn't go to school for an entire year in math. But we decided to open these things here, and we said we were going to do them different. But the connection with homeschooling is that that's often who this thing is marketed towards, that you're sort of already being homeschooled, and we have this virtual charter school, and why don't you just try it? It's free. The state's paying for it. You know, it's not going to hurt you any to use our materials in your homeschool instruction. And so people try it, and you do see a huge level of turnover and withdrawal because those same people try it and then don't stick with it. So it's like a 30% withdrawal rate, which would be, you know, astronomical for any other school. They have the two virtual charter schools have the lowest levels of growth in the student growth in the state. Consistently every year they're at the bottom too. So yeah, it's hard for me. I have a big problem with these things. I think it was very obvious that it wasn't going to work before we tried it. We did it anyways, and it hasn't worked. But that's somewhat the story of how this legislature has worked in the last decade. But you know, I think that was a particularly sad one. And now there's actually a bill for virtual pre-kindergarten.
Virtual pre-kindergarten.
Yeah, so that's just been filed, but it's filed by the chair of the House
I read
Education
about that.
Committee. Yeah, and again, but it made it to the Washington Post because it was like,
Yep.
it's such a preposterous
It
idea.
is,
that must
it
be-
actually is.
They were talking about what is
Virtual
Kindergarten.
pre-kindergarten. So
What
the
is
pre,
the-
like with, oh, go ahead.
That's okay. Well, I mean, you know, they were saying, what is the purpose of going to school is to get the kids to
Socialize.
interact and
Yeah.
socialize and build social skills, and now we're just gonna send them to school online. I just about fell out of my chair laughing at that one.
I didn't hear about that.
Because literally in our textbooks, we read about the benefits of kids going to preschool and building their social skills, interacting with other students, you know, developing that kind of relationship. And when you say, you know, online, pre-K pretty much,
And might as well just put up ABC Mouse and let the kids look at it.
exactly. You know, they might as well just stick them in front of the TV and let them watch Mickey Mouse Clubhouse or whatever education TV shows they have nowadays.
Well, Sesame Street actually produces better outcomes than the virtual schools do. But
That's sad.
Yeah.
It's really sad.
But I have another question. Do you have, have you, just the North Carolina Business Center, have any dealings or have any issues with these vouchers that have been?
That was a big one. We
You
have
might
had
wanna
all.
Tell our
Yeah.
voucher what those are.
So school vouchers are, it's basically you get, parents can get money to send their children to private schools. So rather than going to the public school system, the state will let you apply, and there's certain income limits. So you have to be started off as somewhere around the amount needed to qualify for free and reduced price lunch, which is like 200% of the federal poverty level. And they've raised it a little bit. So you have to be from a lower income family. I think it's not that low though. It's like, you know, if you're a family of 4, I think it's like $60,000 would be the eligibility limit right now. Or you could be a student with a disability, and foster children are eligible as well. The requirement used to be you had to be in public school first, and then I guess be dissatisfied with what's going on, and then you could apply, but they've loosened that a lot. And if you're in kindergarten or first grade, you can just go straight into the voucher. So you'll get, if you're eligible, you can apply, and you get a $4,200 stipend that you can use towards private school tuition. And so the tuition is usually substantially higher than that, so the parents have to make up the difference. So if you want to go to a $20,000 a year private school, you still have to pay the other, you know, $15,800 to get to go. So I guess the theory behind that was similar to charter schools, that would sort of create competition for people, you know, between that basically public school people sort of needed to be sort of to work harder, that, you know, if they were losing their kids to these private schools, they would motivate people to do more in the public schools to try to keep them. And they also really believe in school choice, that parents are going to have more options, and apparently that's going to be sort of better for their kids.
Have you ever had schools kind of like abuse certain systems? Because when I was in high school, they would send home these little survey things, pretty much trying to document how many military kids they have, because it was a public school, but it catered to military kids as well.
Mm-hmm.
And with each military kid they had, they would get a certain amount of money from, you know.
The
Yeah.
federal card.
Yeah.
Federal cards.
And I'm not gonna lie, I had to take one of these electives. It was Teen Living was supposed to teach me how to pretty much live on my own and kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we didn't have a teacher for the whole entire semester. We only had a sub. And my dad made a comment like, you know, why are they getting this money for because you're a military kid? Why are they getting the money for you? Yet they don't even have enough to pay for a teacher to satisfy the class.
Yeah, I've seen things like that. English language learners is probably the most common, where I've seen that. Where, so if you're there are certain characteristics that a student may have where you'll get additional state money because it's just going to be more expensive to educate some children.
Yeah.
And certainly that's the case with students with disabilities. So students with disabilities get about $5,000 extra per student compared to everyone else. It doesn't matter what your disability is, you just get the same. So other states will try to more match it up with, if you have ADHD, it might be a smaller amount, but if you need your own personal aid to help you understand what's happening in class, that's going to be obviously a lot more expensive. But here we just say about $5,000 and it'll sort of all even out, the higher need, lower need. So with English language learners get a lot less. And it's actually not really enough to provide a teacher and translation services. Some of these things are expensive. So it's interesting, similar to what you saw. I saw kids who are English learners who are being classified as special education, because they just need that amount of money to pay for a teacher. And even though that's not you're not allowed to do that because there's federal laws around English learners as well that say, they really don't want you to confuse those two things because the language barrier may be the reason that you're struggling, not that you have a disability or vice versa. So yeah, you'll see, I think that's a consequence of the overall low funding rate that people are sort of having to play these games that they shouldn't be having. Like you shouldn't have to do that. If you have, in my opinion, if you have 25 kids who are English learners, you ought to be able to put them in a classroom with a teacher and have the materials that they need and translations going home. But I think the reality is you don't have that, so then schools end up doing things sometimes
In
creative.
Cumberland County, Cumberland County sometimes you have one ESL teacher for 4 elementary schools.
Yeah, and we've gotten there on a lot of things that I think surprise people. Nurses, I always assume, people are blown away that there isn't a nurse in their school.
Oh no, when I was in the same high school and stuff, thank God I never had to see the school nurse, but I'd always hear she's not in today, or she's supposed to be in on every single Wednesday or every other Wednesday, something like that. And I'm just like, why don't we have one every single day? Cause
Right. I hope the bad thing happens on Wednesday. Yeah.
Because I think we actually did have an emergency. There was a student who fainted. They had an allergic reaction to peanuts.
Yep.
And the nurse wasn't there. They actually had to call an ambulance to get them, the help they needed.
Yeah, and they'll move from school to school, and I think that really shocks people. Counselors, same deal. I think the ratio is 1 to 18, one counselor to 1,800 students is pretty much the common average. Something around with nurses. These are nowhere near the recommended levels of what you ought to have. I mean, you're supposed to have at worst 1 to 750, which just still seems like a lot to me. But so we're pretty. That's the thing that worries me about our system, though. Is if you think about how that's expensive to fix. If you need 3 times as many nurses as you have, or 3 times as many counselors. People are always the most expensive thing in the system, and then, it's a good thing. We value them first, but adding that number of folks is pretty mind-boggling how much it would cost. I think so to get to the nationally recommended ratios for nurses, counselors, librarians, and school psychologists would cost about $650 million. So, I'm talking about
Are we talking about for North Carolina or?
Just North Carolina.
Just for.
Just for North Carolina.
So, but that's why it is hard to get your head around some of these numbers.
I was thinking maybe you were thinking
Yeah.
of the United States.
No, just here.
Well, look at the amount of money that, what's his name, the new superintendent here has asked for just to bring Cumberland County up. He has put in a request for, I don't know, it's a big amount to bring them up with social workers, and I can't remember, but I know it's huge.
Right.
There's
That
a,
our superintendent from North County,
I was at the same event as that, but I didn't get to talk. I've heard.
he came to speak to a big group of us here. He's very impressive. I hope
Good.
that he is
Thank you.
really as sincere
That's great.
and all as.
they seem to think he is, anybody you talk to said that he's really.
What's his name?
Conley.
Yeah.
Superintendent
And
Conley.
he came to enter all this by way of special education, and all by accident. It's really very, very interesting.
That's great.
And, so I'm hoping to see some good things.
I think that's a smart place to put money locally if you can, because what's ended up happening is the teachers had to play all those roles. And so at the same time as they, they feel like they've had a lot of other issues, there's a lot being heaped on teachers. They're responsible for test results, and they're responsible for administering epinephrine when someone has a peanut allergy, or and then somebody comes in and has experienced a traumatic event. Maybe they've seen someone be shot or something like that, and then the teacher has to exactly. So it's an unbelievable amount that's getting heaped on teachers. It's unbelievable what they've done. I think they haven't gotten enough credit for sort of getting us through this time. Now is the time, I think, to start to address some of these other things, and we're slowly doing it. But you'll see, it's just like, the problem's 600 million, and we'll put 50 million in, or So it looks like you're sort of doing some things. That sounds like a lot of money, but you're not actually moving the needle on solving the problem at all. So that, to me, that's progress, I guess, that they're paying lip service to these things being important, because I think some of these same people who, when they first came in, they were calling teachers lazy and saying they shouldn't get raises because they get summers off, and that kind of rhetoric I don't hear about as much anymore, because that didn't really play well. Like, people in North Carolina aren't really having that. But that is how they
Summer off, I don't remember getting a summer off.
I know, that's exactly
And I didn't either,
It's
because
kind of-
I worked in the summer getting ready for the school year.
Yeah, I found that funny because I remember senior year, whenever students were talking about how they can't wait to graduate and stuff, it's like, yeah, you guys get to leave and I'm still stuck here. Some of the teachers would say that.
Yeah. No, I mean what was the other? This is another example, I think, of why teachers are the best advocates over there, though, because they're the people who are most. It's easier for them to point that out when someone says something like that. Like, the one interesting thing was around the May 17th rally. One of the legislators said that this was being organized by a bunch of union thugs, and so even though I said we can't have unions and whatnot, so there's a lot of untruth in that little tiny statement. But a teacher who was probably getting close to retirement age and didn't really care about what anyone thought, but she's about 65 years old and sweet older lady, and she just walked straight into his office during that march and with the cameras around her and said, "Am I a union thug?" And it was really she did it very respectfully, but it was like a really great moment, and they had a really nice conversation, and it was actually productive, where he apologized for what he had said, and they had a good conversation. But that's something I can't do. I can't. You need to have the actual. It's nice to have people whose job it is to work in those buildings and get how to navigate them and all that. But without the actual people who are impacted by the policies coming, it doesn't seem real to them, I don't think. And so there's been a million examples of teachers who have done things like that have had a huge impact. It's one thing to see the numbers or to hear an advocate saying it, but it's another thing when somebody's describing what it's like in their classroom. So.
And I almost wonder too, how many of those legislatures have kids, how many of their kids are in regular public school?
Yeah, not as high of a percentage as the rest of us. I think it's some of them maybe did have kids in the public school, but I still think so much has changed that it's hard for them to understand what it's like. I think that a lot of them are retired. Quite a few. A lot went to private school, but we do have the chair of the House. One of the chairs of the House Education Committees, Jeffrey Elmore, is a teacher, so that helps. So there's a fair amount of people there who have background